We begin from the Korean Peninsula, where the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also known as North Korea, last Friday fired another ballistic missile over Japan. This comes just days after the United Nations imposed the tougher sanctions on Pyongyang. The test was reported to be the DPRK's longest ever flight of an intermediate ballistic missile. Chinese ambassador to the United States, Mr. Cui Tiankai, said over the weekend that China would never recognize the DPRK as a nuclear state. So what's next?
A sixth nuclear test and its longest ever missile flight. That was the DPRK's response to the new UN sanctions. Experts say the flight duration indicates it could reach the U.S. territory of Guam. U.S. President Donald Trump stood in front of an American bomber to deliver a message.
We will defend our people, our nations, and our civilization from all who dare to threaten our way of life. This includes the regime of North Korea, which has once again shown its utter contempt for its neighbors and for the entire world community.
This is also the second DPRK missile that passed over Japan in recent weeks. The Japanese Prime Minister said it was time for the international community to act in unison.
It has become clear that the latest sanctions need to be imposed in full. North Korea needs to understand that if it continues on this path, there is no bright future.
China has insisted that both the DPRK and the U.S. must make concessions to ease tensions. China's ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai, said that a first step by the U.S. would be an end to threats against the DPRK. The ambassador also stated that China would never recognize the DPRK as a nuclear state.
I don't think nuclear weapons will bring security to DPRK or South Korea or anybody else. It could only make things much worse. I hope people will have a clear understanding of the seriousness of the issue. We are certainly opposed to the existence of nuclear weapons anywhere on the Korean Peninsula, anywhere.
The DPRK is defiant in the face of the latest UN sanctions, saying its leader Kim Jong-un vowed to complete the country's nuclear weapons program. This week, the leaders of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan will hold a summit on the DPRK on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York. The international community is on the lookout on what kind of agreements could be reached in this summit and how jitters over the peninsula could be eased.
So how can the DPRK, the North Korea, and the U.S. dial back tensions? Is it ever possible? Let's loop in our panel to find out. In Beijing studio, we have Mr. Da Wei, Assistant President of the University of International Relations here in China. Welcome, sir. In Washington, we are joined by Jonathan Pollack, a Senior Fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. We're also hoping a South Korean origin professor would also join us later in our discussion. But first of all, let me go to you, Mr. Da, here in Beijing. How should we understand the words coming from the Chinese ambassador, Mr. Cui Tiankai, to the United States? He said over the weekend, China will not recognize DPRK, North Korea, as a nuclear state. But you know, Mr. Da, that DPRK has nuclear capabilities. What does that mean?
I think when Ambassador Cui Tiankai talk about that, I think he talked in a legal perspective. I think, yes, it's true that DPRK now has some kind of nuclear capability, but legally it will never be admitted as a nuclear state because their nuclear program is illegal and it's banned by the UN resolution, and the country violated the NPT regime. So no country will
NPT
recognize.
regime meaning non-proliferation treaty, of course.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so no country, I think, will recognize the nuclear state. Only the 5 nuclear power which had nuclear capability, nuclear weapon before the NPT treaty was signed, and are the legal nuclear states. So we need to distinguish the two things. One is legally a nuclear state, The other is a country has a nuclear capability, nuclear weapon. Yes, North Korea, DPRK may have some nuclear capability, but legally it will never be recognized as a nuclear state.
Got your point. Very important point over there, because a lot of people do not understand what exactly China meant when Ambassador Cui said so, but with the interpretation there, very crucial. And let me go to you, Mr. Pollack. The UN ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Ms. Henley said, United States has exhausted all diplomatic means when it comes to the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. How should we understand that?
I'm not quite sure what she meant. There seems to be a lack of recognition that the new sanctions that have been imposed are very, very new. No one, I think, expects overnight results. The consensus of all the members of the Security Council was that North Korea had to pay a bigger price, and it is paying a bigger price for its continued nuclear and missile testing. So I don't know whether she's saying that in a way just to stir people up. But I think she needs to be very careful about the words that she uses. The implication is, if we've exhausted it, then what's the point? But I think there really is a very definite point, and I think most of the time I would like to think that she accepts that. That's certainly the premise of U.S. policy, as I understand it.
I see. Another thing which many people do not understand is the president of South Korea said also over the weekend that South Korea do not see any possibility for now about dialogue anymore with North Korea. Tougher sanctions to come. Mr. Da, you've been a seasoned observer of the latest situation. How do you interpret that?
I think what President Moon meant was that, currently, at current phase, negotiation or talk is not a good choice because the UN Security Council just passed a new resolution, and the international community just decided to press North Korea harsher, So we need to wait and see if this kind of, resolution can change DPRK's calculation. And now currently, at current phase, I think the priority is sanction, is pressure. But I don't think President Moon excluded negotiation or dialogue in future. I think if DPRK made some concession, if DPRK decided to stop nuclear and missile tests and stop provocation, I think in the long run, even in the mid-run, I think the negotiation is still something desirable, particularly for South Korea.
And of course, at this point, we are also joined by Professor Sung-yoon Lee, who is a Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He's joining us also from the United States at this point. Professor, welcome to our program. Professor Lee, we also have noticed there has been an interesting quote coming from the, of course, attention-exhausting Twitter of President Trump recently. He talked about his Twitter diplomacy, particularly shouting to his North Korean counterpart. He said this: "Ask Kim how Rocket Man is doing. Long gas lines forming in North Korea. Too bad." That's just a quote coming from his personal tweet. Of course, we are not here to give an official interpretation as to what exactly this U.S. president meant in his personal tweet, but how should we understand the focus of Washington now when it comes to what to deal with and how to deal with North Korea? Is it about the fuel now? Or is it about dialogue now? Is it about the military action now? Or is it about just shouting now? Professor.
Well, as an academic, I must first take issue with President Trump's failure to give proper attribution to that phrase, Rocket Man, which the British journal The Economist, on its front page, back in 2006, carried a photo of Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, and called him Rocket Man, in reference to North Korea's 7-rocket salute, including a long-range missile test on America's birthday, July 4th, 2006. Now, I want to say that all this is highly coordinated, the messages, the hawkish message coming from the U.S. ambassador to the UN and the defense secretary and President Trump. But I'm somewhat skeptical that this is a very highly well-coordinated strategy of ambiguity, sending a stern message to North Korea and perhaps even to China and Russia on the eve of a major meetings among the heads of state at the UN General Assembly this week. We know North Korea provokes not only on a major holiday, but also North Korea likes in on its neighbors' parade, South Korea and Chinese. Earlier this year, North Korea.
We have some connecting problems now with a professor for now, but let's go to, I did understand your point, sir, though, over there in the Tufts University. Let's go to you with Mr. Pollack in Washington, D.C. You know, one of the things that people really need to understand is what exactly is the focus of attention in Washington as to what is going to be the actions and reactions toward North Korea for now. Of course, Professor Lee talked about the General Assembly speech President Trump is going to give on Tuesday, first ever as president. But there are a lot of media focus, Mr. Pollack, about the fuel issue in
yes, there
North
is
Korea.
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, it's curious that there are times when the U.S. policy process seems to concentrate on this issue and have a degree of direction, but then I must say often on the Sunday news shows many things are expressed by senior U.S. officials, perhaps in part for domestic consumption. Certainly President Trump's incessant tweeting, and in the case that you just talked about, it's not so much a tweet, it's a taunt. It's almost the kind of thing that we would expect from North Korea rather than from the President of the United States. And very frankly, I just don't see what useful purpose it serves. The United States wants everyone to be serious about this issue, and that has to begin with the United States itself and with the U.S. leadership. So we continue to hear, to a certain extent, very different opinions and judgments, which, very frankly, I don't see, to say the least, as a very, very encouraging sign. There really needs to be coherence and message discipline that we just don't see yet.
Mr. Pollack, I have to ask you more about that because there are several news reports recently with New York Times as well talking about the fuel issue with the DPRK. As you may know, the recent sanctions is about cutting further fuel exports to DPRK by China and some of the other countries as well. So there has been a lot of history about whether the United States has been functioning or not functioning at all to cut off the possibility for DPRK to develop ICBM and nuclear weapons. There is specific thing about the UDMH, that's a specific fuel that would propel the kind of engine that would help to launch the ICBM that North Korea has. And according to the New York Times article, asking for senior officials served both in the Bush Jr. administration and Obama administration, they didn't recall any specific measure were taken in order to cut off that possibility to North Korea.
Well, this, of course, is a report in today's New York Times, which I have read. I'm aware that there's been some speculation about this fuel. I personally do not think it is beyond the realm of possibility that North Korea could have its own indigenous capability to produce it. Very frankly, I think that the report was a bit exaggerated. It is true we see evidence of North Korea using different kinds of fuels in some of its missile tests, but in this case, yet again, the speculation is somehow this is getting into North Korea rather than North Korea being able to do it itself. So how pivotal it is, it's hard to say. It's clearly a very volatile kind of fuel. It may give them some enhanced capacity, but we don't always want to accept uncritically what we read in the New York Times.
Right. Okay. Well, having said that, though, it's important to talk about the focus of the attention now in Washington. The DPRK has said something Washington usually argued back, and this time it's also about the capability. The DPRK said Saturday it sought equilibrium with military force, the U.S., and the DPRK seemed to be perfecting its nuclear weapon delivery system with all these tests. However, the DPRK lacks two parts of the nuclear triad to genuinely reach the United States. Although the DPRK boasts land-based ICBM that are par with U.S. Minuteman, so-called ICBMs, the U.S. boasts the nuclear Trident missiles fired from submarines, while DPRK's nuclear submarines are still in the testing phase. The U.S. also boasts the air-based nukes delivered by B-2 stealth bombers, while the DPRK hasn't tested any strategic bombers yet. There seems to be a competition going on, at least in that list. But having said that, though, Professor Lee, I hope we could talk to you now. What do you make of the next step? Are we going to see further sanctions, particularly after Tuesday, President Trump delivers his speech at the General Assembly for the very first time?
Yes, there will be an effort to enforce sanctions, both U.S. sanctions and an effort to try to get world on board, all UN member states, to do their part to enforce sanctions, and that's the right approach. Diplomatic options and other forms of rhetorical bellicosity is not helpful because we are not at that stage of having to resort to military force, which really is the very last resort. You know, there's a cliche in our field of international relations, diplomacy does not take no for an answer. So for top diplomats to say there's nothing more we can do, it reflects more the frustration on the part of the administration rather than a sound policy intention. I think that would paint the U.S. as that's motivated more by aggressive behavior than North Korea. So it's very unhelpful. And most importantly, I don't think North Korea is deterred by that kind of bluster. I think North Korea is very crafty in climbing up the ladder of escalation, and with the next provocation, which could come this week when the world leaders are gathered at the UN in New York, if North Korea an ICBM test, that certainly won't lead to military retaliation by the United States because the world will not see that as cause for war.
I see. Well, Mr. Da, you've been listening to your two colleagues over there, but here's the thing. There has been another drill being tested by both the United States, Japan, and South Korea today, with some stealth fighters flying from the air base in Guam, which is supposed to be the place where North Korea claimed to attack if offended. So are we, meaning China, going to accept any kinds of military actions undertaken toward North Korea as North Korea's neighbor? And meanwhile, how is China going to be able to protect its own security, both from its north neighbor, which now has nuclear capability, and then also from the others in the names of attacking North Korea?
Of course, China, I don't think China will accept or China want to see any military conflict or even war on Korean Peninsula. As you said, China is a neighboring country. So this kind of military conflict could cause, serious consequence to China. But having said that, there is a possibility of military conflict or even a war on Korean Peninsula, and also I think there is a possibility that North Korea, DPRK's nuclear facility, their capability may have some kind of problem, for example, the leaks, that could pollute the, the neighboring area in northeast China. So I think on the one hand, China need to be ready to, prevent this kind of pollution, this kind of potential pollution from DPRK. On the other side, I think China need to prepare for military, conflict between DPRK and other countries, and also, I think also it's a time for China and other countries to talk quietly on the crisis management and and also the if something happened, what all the related country can do together to prevent the worst scenario. So I think these are the things that China needs to think about and needs to do.
Needs to think about, but at the same time, Mr. Da, could you help us to understand this? Because on the one hand, China wants the dialogue and the conversation with DPRK, for example, and the United States going on. But at the same time, China needs to prepare for the worst scenarios. If the one is being paid attention to, for example, the worst scenarios, what China could do, and in talk with some of the other countries, will that be taken advantage by some of the other countries, suggesting, well, China already, in a way, giving a nod, a possibility for military actions toward the North Korea by us, and therefore, let's just go.
Yeah, I think this is a long-time Chinese concern for this kind of dialogue with, to be frank, with the United States. We don't want to send a wrong signal to other countries. But I think, now it's already, because the situation is so dangerous, I think through dialogue, during the, when we have dialogue with other countries, we can make it very clear. This is not a signal. This is not a green light for the military action on Korean Peninsula. I think this is the only way that we can work it out.
Mr. Pollack, you have a lot of information about the Korean Peninsula issue. Help us to understand, how should we understand these different layers of things going on, so-called exhaustion of the diplomatic means by the United States, claimed by the ambassador to the United Nations, of course. And then there are also suggestions of dialogues going on at a certain level with the North and also the United States. While at the same time, people and parties are preparing for the worst scenario. How should we understand the different layers from your perspective? Very briefly, sir.
I think that there's some informal or not fully official dialogue, so-called Track 1.5 activities, where North Korean diplomats may be present and where there may be U.S. diplomats as observers. My impression is that these have not been at all satisfactory if people see some possibility for some kind of a meaningful breakthrough. I think that the fundamental reality right now is that North Korea continues to push its advantage, and that it is not, at least for the present, showing any signs of responsiveness to the outside world. Quite the contrary. There's almost seems to be a desperate search to enhance its capabilities. We can ask why that is so, and maybe speculate a bit about that. But I think under the circumstances, the most important thing, and I think Dawei has just highlighted that, is for a candid, frank, private conversation between all the involved countries, and I would put the U.S. and China very, very high on that list. The media may speculate endlessly about what is going on there or not, but I have enough confidence that both governments, if they were to meet in that context to discuss these possibilities, would be very careful about their words.
Right.
I hope very frank about their concerns and possible actions, and on that basis we might have some measure of, I don't want to call it stabilization, but at least risk management if things were to go from bad to much worse.
I see. Well, on Tuesday, U.S. President Donald Trump is going to give his first ever speech at the General Assembly of the United Nations, and also coming later in the week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is going to give a speech as well on the General Assembly. I'm sure there will be a lot of things going on. Meanwhile, the Chinese and the American president have agreed that they are going to meet each other during President Trump's later visit to China later in the year. Hopefully, these will be occasions for things to work out for the better. Thank you so much for the three of you for being with us. Dawei, Jonathan Pollack, and also Sung-yoon Lee. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us.